Well, anyway, welcome to the courthouse. I'm Bob Akland, for anyone who doesn't know that. I'm president of the association here at the courthouse, HSCPA, and we are celebrating the 150th year of this building's existence. It was built in 1869, and so we're making a big deal out of that. 150 years, it's still here. The county has left to go to Fort Edward, but we are taking over and managing it as an association, a nonprofit organization, and trying to keep it going and make a community center out of it, but also just sort of honor the architecture of the whole place and to make it useful as a building for a community center. So that's kind of why we're here and what we're doing. Before I get into my little talk tonight, I want to just mention that next week at the same time, on Thursday evening at 7, tell your friends, and you also come along, see if we can fill these seats. But Jack Waite will be here. He's an architect from Albany. He has a home in Shushan, and he was quite instrumental in helping convince our local people, including Bruce, that this building deserved being preserved, and he would help in any way he could. And the committee got organized, and a number of people from the community set up the organization to preserve the building. And so that's how we got our start back in 2001, 2002. And then the county, since we had the organization in place, sold or made the exchange with the town to take on this building and own this building. And they still own it today, and the HSCPA manages it. But anyway, that's coming up next week. Jack will be here, and he's also going to bring one of his associates, Matt Scheit, who's been working with us in our restoration work, and they'll fill you in on the architect that helped design this building, and then some of the restoration work that we have accomplished already and what we have yet to do. So that'll be next week at 7 o'clock. All right, again, I appreciate your coming. We're expecting a few more. Maybe they'll show up, so be friendly to them when they show up. My title today is The Old Washington County Courthouse in Salem, and I'm talking about how it came to be built in Salem. I'm going to review a little bit of what was talked about last week, but then I'm also going to talk about some of the trials that happened here and other experiences in the building. And as I was doing the research on it, and there's a lot of impressive things about how this building came to be here, but it's kind of a story of legacy and some people really working hard to make things happen. But it also is a story after 150 years, and actually going back before that even, a story of change. A lot of things have changed in Salem since Salem was organized as a community and had its first courthouse. So, as I say, I want to start back a little bit, give a little more background before I get to actual trials that took place in this building. Just about the size of Washington County. I posted a map here, that's one of the tourism maps, that shows the existing Washington County. But it wasn't always this size. When it was originally created, it was part of Albany County. Albany County, where the capital is today, but Albany County extends quite a bit westward from there, and at that time even further westward. And it included all of this area that was part of Washington County, and to the north, and also, as I'll tell you in a second, in 1766, it had included the Vermont section, but that was split off from Albany County in 1766. 1772, Albany County then was officially divided into 3 counties, and so Albany maintained a lot of the territory, but then Montgomery County was beyond that, further to the west, and that took on a lot more than what is now in Montgomery County, Amsterdam area. It extended quite a bit further south. And then Charlotte County was our county here. But it extended quite a bit further north from here. Because after the Revolutionary War, well, Charlotte was the name of King George's wife, by the way. So we dropped that and we took on Washington's name. And that's how we became Washington County after the war, Revolutionary War. Our big hero, and still is today a big hero. But in 1788, looking northward, Clinton County, Essex, Franklin, St. Lawrence County was split off Washington County. All right? That had all been part of Washington County. So we kind of lost that territory, but 3 years later, in 1791, with the help really of General Williams, who was in the legislature at the time, he was able to arrange that we got Easton, Cambridge, White Creek, and Jackson, because Albany County was splitting off Rensselaer County, and this was going to be the northern part of Rensselaer County. Williams said we kind of need those 4 towns in our Washington County, and that's how we got those 4 towns, which made some people in Rensselaer County unhappy. But by getting these 4 towns here, it made Salem more centralized, you might say. There was still more space to the south of us. And so us having a courthouse, for example, hey, we're centralized, right? Central location. And then finally, in 1813, Warren County, which was to our west, was split off. But even that was part of Washington County originally. So you get an idea of the very earliest time, Washington County was very big. And then little by little it was shaped to what it is today with 17 towns. And the distance from north to south is about 70 miles, which is quite a distance if you want to walk it, or ride a bicycle, or ride a horse, or ride in a carriage. Even if you ride a train, it takes a while to get from north to south. And then it's about, I'd say 30 to 35 miles, depending on where you are, east to west. It it has 831 square miles. That means anything to you. And in the 2010 census, there were 63,000 people living in our county. 63,000. Now there are probably 80,000 live in the city of Albany. So you get an idea, comparison-wise, 63,000 is in our whole county. The other thing that you might look at the map about is the terrain. Generally it's north-south hills and valleys that run in a north-south direction. So to go from the eastern part of the county to the western part, you have to go over a lot of hills. And if you can you get to Fort Edward from here? Have any of you done that? But if you try doing that, you got a lot of curvy roads. You kind of understand in the early times, if you go back and think of how they must have gotten there, or people from there coming here, a lot of up and down and curvy roads, and it must have taken a while to get here. But anyway, transportation has changed. And from just walking on paths or riding a horse on paths to finally getting today automobiles and trucks and so on paved highways. Most of them are paved, right? Anyway, it's quite a change from the earliest times. I just want to give one more comparison at this point, which is Washington County in 1790. So go back before 1800. 1790, Washington County had 14,000 people total. And Salem had a total of 1,021. So it was like 1/14 of the whole county lived in Salem, in the town of Salem. Okay. Now Al went over this last week, but some of you weren't here, so I'm reviewing this part. The first settlers in Salem came in 1761, and it was a wilderness. 1761 was a time when the French and Indian War was going on, And there were two guys that came from Massachusetts. Their names were James Turner and Joshua Conkey. They were soldiers. They traveled through the area, admired it. They came back another year and they made a log house down where, I guess where you could say where the little park is that they have with a gazebo there. And they lived in that for a while. Then they went back to Massachusetts and brought some other settlers with them. They were Presbyterians, and they got a minister from Ireland to come and be their minister. His name was Thomas Clark. And he served for a year, and then he brought about 100 settlers from Ireland to live in this same community. And they intermixed and they managed quite well together. So that's Thomas Clark. But it was a region that was basically wilderness, as I mentioned. You know, if you go out in the woods and you just walk through the woods and it seems to be endless up at Merck Forest, for example, that's about what it was like here. And I mean, what are you going to do? You can hunt, and maybe there's some berries here and there, but you know, to raise a family, you got to do something. So they had to clear the land, certainly. So it required great effort from the settlers as they cleared the land, built their homes and barns, and raised their families in a very rudimentary way, at least to get started. You can almost imagine that. That's so in the early 1760s. But in 1766, Dr. Clark, the guy from Ireland, with his followers, built a log meeting house where they had their services and church services, and they also had meetings like variety of things. But in another 4 years, they were ready to build a frame house instead of just a wood log house. And here, this building came to be not only for services, but they had court sessions in this house. They called the old log, or the old meeting house. Court recordings of the county were suspended during the first years of the Revolutionary War. There was a lot of activity going on here during the Revolutionary War, you know. Burgoyne was coming down from Canada, and there was all kinds of resistance by American forces, and then, you know, Burgoyne tried to get more supplies from Bennington, and that came pretty close to our area. So there was a lot of the settlers here that just moved out of the way, but then came back after the things settled down again. And Saratoga was a victory for American forces, and everybody's feeling good again. So anyway, the record keeping was resumed in 1779, and between 1779 and 1796, court was held in the home of John Williams. More about him in a minute. Until a wooden courthouse on North Main Street was built, and that was in 1796. That's about where the town offices are located right now, but there was a actual courthouse, wooden courthouse with a tower on it, and a jail was built behind it.
Are there records of slaves here during that time?
There may be. I didn't find that when I was reading, but I think there were. But anyway, that was a courthouse that was clearly defined as a courthouse, and that was the first one in the county. Another one was built in Fort Edward, not Fort Edward, but Hudson Falls. They call it Sandy Hill. And that was sometime later. I think that was 1806 or something. But I wanted to spend a little time talking about John Williams, because here's where the legacy part of the story comes in. He was quite a person, as it turned out. He was born in England in 1752, and he spent his youth in England. He obviously was very bright by what he did once he got here, but he studied medicine and surgery in London, and then he decided to emigrate to the United States. And he did that in 1773. He was 21 years old. So he came to the United States, and somehow, and I don't know if he had some kind of connection or he was just wandering, but he wound up here. It was called New Perth at that time in Charlotte County. But he was very well received by the people that were here. He was a skilled medical person and surgeon, so if somebody got injured in some way, they had to have an arm amputated, he could take care of that. But anyway, he was in medical practice. And then, going back, he was single, and it turned out that James Turner, who had been the guy that helped settle Salem to begin with, his wife died. I mean, he died, and his wife was then a widow. Well, John Williams was very happy to take on a wife, and apparently she was relatively young anyway, because they had 4 children, as it turns out, and one was John Jr. But that's just the beginning of the story, because he was very active in military and political issues too. So, for example, he was in the New York State Provincial Congress. That was the 1775 time, as they were just getting organized as a, what would you call it, opposing Britain. Then he was appointed to the military as a surgeon for the county regiment, then the colonel of the county regiment, and he was that as a colonel from 1776 until 83, and was very active and involved in battles and all the rest. And then brigadier general after the war was over, but he was assigned that in 1786, and that title, general, stuck with him for the rest of his life. One of the things he did, and this was sort of a key part of the legacy that came to him and to Salem, is that he purchased former Tory property. Now, the Tories were the loyalists that still wanted to stay with England and Britain, but the war went the other way, and the result was that they lost their property, and the state bought it up. Well, John Williams bought it from the state, and he bought tremendous amounts of land. All of Putnam County, or town of Putnam, I mean, half of Whitehall, half of Hebron, half of Salem, basically, and he had just tremendous amount of land when he wound up. But then he was able to sell that, and from the proceeds, do other things with his money. But he wasn't done. He was served as a member of the New York State Constitutional Convention when they were writing the Constitution for our state. Then he was in the Assembly. He spent some time in the Senate from New York State. And then in the 1790s, he was a candidate for Congress and won 4 years of service in the U.S. Congress. Every time that he got involved in these organizations, he came to be a leader. He suggested, for example, that they study the possibilities of building a canal from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, and he organized the committee. He was put in charge of the committee, and they came back in a year or two with confirmation, yes, it could be done. And the same with a canal between the Hudson River and Champlain, Lake Champlain, and yes, that could be done. So he was very instrumental in kind of moving New York State ahead. And when the state finally built and completed the canal, the Erie Canal, they then claimed the title of the Empire State because of what it did to open up the West. But John Williams was a part of that, at least to get it started. And then the sad thing happened. Apparently he got sick, and in 1806 he was 54 years old, he passed away. So all that energy, all the enthusiasm, all the good ideas, he passed on and didn't have any more time. So, but it was a legacy that he had created and amassed a lot of wealth for his family and future generations, but he did an awful lot for Salem also in the process. So, courthouse history in Salem. I mentioned already the first recorded court proceedings were in the old meeting house back in the 1770s. John Williams had proceedings in his home. Well, they didn't have a real building yet, but then once that happened, that was here in Salem, and he had some part in getting it to come to Salem. That was the first one in the county. And so the county legislators designated Salem as a county seat, and a lot of government business was done here. There was a second county seat in Sandy Hill, and so there was sort of a two-part system here. But the idea was that Salem could take care of the southern part of the county, and Sandy Hill could take care of the rest of it. So that was how it was set up. There's a name for that. Bruce, do you know what it is? Well, no. I was trying to come up with it. Looking at things, I just couldn't get to it in time. I can't get it either. Al mentioned it last week, so we'll let him stay on his video. Anyway, we were a county seat.
Halfshire.
That's it, Halfshire. There you go. Halfshire, which is a British name, you know. But the idea is that there are two parts to governing. So the building on North Main Street here was completed in 1796, and then I think it was 1803 or so that the one in Sandy Hill was done. So that's when they had the Halfshire completed. After 70 years, it was very obvious that the building on North Main Street was just not holding up very well. It was a wooden structure, and the maintenance apparently wasn't too well maintained. So they had to get a replacement, and the jail also up there. So that's when the whole act got put together to get the second courthouse here in Salem. And so what were the reasons behind that? How could we manage to get it? Well, part of it had to do with, are we centrally located or not? Well, we kind of are, because we have these towns south of us, and then these ones to the north just above us. But then this is where Hudson Falls is, and they could take care of these. So that was one thing. Then the second thing was Salem had already been designated a county seat and had been a county seat for 70 years, so let's maintain that. And we had the existing county courthouse, so let's maintain that. We had an energetic lawyer and judge who'd been a lawyer and judge, but they elected him, kind of like they did Bruce. It was an issue that they needed to get passed. They elected him to be supervisor. His name was James Gibson, and he'd grown up here, and he was very active in a lot of ways, similar to what General Williams was, but this is now 70 years later, almost 65 years later. But anyway, so he got on the case and was successful in arguing the benefits of keeping the courthouse in Salem. There was a John M. Williams, who was the grandson of the general, who provided adequate land on East Broadway, where we are right here, for the building complex. And he also had a lot of influence. Again, he had inherited wealth, and he had a lot of influence in the county and especially in the community. But he was able to persuade people in the county. But kind of the clincher was that the town and the village of Salem both committed to $5,000 apiece toward the building of the courthouse. That would be 1/3 of the value of what the courthouse was going to cost. And so how could the county say no to that, right? And that kind of made it happen. And in the end, Salem's influential leaders and the enthusiasm of the citizens of the community provided the strongest reasons for selecting Salem as the best site in the county for the new Washington County Courthouse. In December of '68, the Board of Supervisors approved Salem as the location for the new courthouse and established a committee to work out all the details and report back to the board. And they chose James Gibson to be the chairman of that committee, which is kind of interesting. So what was the result of this? Well, the immediate reaction to the decision was a jubilant celebration by the citizens of Salem. They had a torchlight parade down Main Street. They went to the hotel and they had toasts for all kinds of reasons. And they stayed late. But anyway, it was a happy time in Salem when we had a new courthouse that was coming our way. Then they arranged to find an architect, and they went to Troy, where Marcus Cummings was just setting up really as a new architect in that community. There had been a fire in Troy, and he had a lot of business there, but he agreed to come up here and design a building. And not only that, but he went to work. This was in December that he was contacted and said, yeah, I'll do it. The January meeting of the Board of Supervisors was coming up. He got everything all in order, and he had a whole laid out description of what had to be done in building this building, and the cost was going to be $30,000. So we got that done, so they could move on from there. Then they hired the contractors for carpentry and masonry, and that came in under budget. The foundation was worked on. Of course, they had to excavate and then lay the foundation, which was laid stone. And they had that done by June of '69. Now, how long do you think it would take them beyond that to do the rest of the building? I mean, we got a lot of brickwork and all the trim and all the woodwork.
6 months.
By December, they were done, if you can imagine. An army of people in here working like crazy. And so it was completed on schedule and under budget. And then on top of that, the result of this decision to build a courthouse in Salem is that the old Washington County Courthouse is still standing in Salem 150 years later, and it's managed by a nonprofit organization now, HSCPA. I had to get that in. But that was a result. That's all background. And so now let's talk about the court and the trials that took place here. I really didn't get too many because it was kind of hard to put all that together because of, well, complication. I'll get into that a little bit. But just the type of courts that there are. First of all, there are town courts and village courts. You may be familiar with that. So if you get a speeding ticket, you go to the town court or wherever you are. Hopefully it doesn't happen too often. But then if it's a more serious case, then you have to go to a county court. And that's what we have here. So there's a criminal court, a civil court, surrogate court, and a family court. And all those were represented in this building at the earliest times. And now they're all represented, of course, in Fort Edward, in their complex there, which is pretty impressive if you get over on that side. You called for jury duty or something, you know, kind of take a tour around. But anyway, so that's what we need to talk about here tonight. To get information about the earliest time. Now the building was finished in December of '69, so I started looking at information from 1870 on. And you go to the archives in the complex up there, and they have all this information on microfilm. And so the names are there, but unless you know the names, you don't know which microfilm reel to look at. So she pulled out some for me, the archivist pulled out some and set them aside. So I started looking through them, and you crank the crank and look through all this stuff flying by, and stop once in a while. And I'm just going to give you some of the ideas of some of the things that they brought up. A lot had to do with people that were indicted for serving alcohol on Sundays. You can't do that here in Washington County. At least you couldn't then, in the 1870s. And it was, you know, case after case of somebody serving alcohol. But then, of course, there were assaults of various kinds, fights, use of a weapon, injury to another, but it was just an assault. Then there were murders, that the fighting went too far. Robbery. Somebody stole the horse, but then not only stole the horse, but stole the harness too. Then there was a indictment for somebody that stole coal, and coal was a common way to heat your house. 4 cows had been stolen, and that was somebody was indicted for that. And of course, money. Somebody robbed another person of that. Forged and counterfeited instruments of various kinds, signing checks that weren't theirs or otherwise forging something. And then escape from jail, like Charlie last night, escaped from jail. Jail bail, that's got to be raised. But anyway, those are kinds of things, and I don't have any of those to tell you about, except I do have a murder trial. And Margaret kind of helped me with this too. She found it, and I had seen it, but she gave me how she found it, and I went back and got a little more detail. And there was a lot of detail, actually, because the trial went on for several days, and all the questions and answers were listed there. But anyway, the man was Charles Shaw. He lived with his wife in Cambridge, and his wife got very sick, and then his children got very sick, and the doctor came, and there wasn't anything he could do because it was obviously these people had been poisoned. And so the wife died, and 3 of the girls died, and it was a pretty sad situation. And Charles was arrested along with his friend. I don't know how close a neighbor she was, but she was a friend, Sarah Briggs, who was also tied into this. But they tried them separately, and Charles was on trial, and the doctors were talking about having found evidence of corrosive substance in the body that had led to the death of these people. And obviously poison, mercury mixed with something else in the food or beverage that they consumed. And so there were these deaths. There was a lot of detailed testimony. Question was, maybe it was bad meat that they had eaten. Maybe there was some sausage that had decayed and that made them sick. But you don't usually die from that. You may get sick, but not die. Finally, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to be hanged, and hanged right in the Washington County Jail. This is 1873, by the way. So it's just shortly after the building was completed. He appealed his case, and they had the appeal before he was hanged. And it turns out that in his original trial, there were 3 judges that were part of the, I'll call it a board, that were listening to the case. And they finished the end of 1 week and took the weekend off, but came back on Monday. But only 2 of the judges showed up on Monday. One of the village judges couldn't make it and didn't show up. He did come on Tuesday, and so all 3 were back together, and they went on with the case. But he hadn't gone back to find out what they had done on Monday, apparently. So that when they made the final judgment and found Shaw guilty, it was considered by the appeal court that it was not appropriate, that they had to have listened to all the testimony, or at least got filled in, before rendering judgment. So they said a new trial should be given. I couldn't find a new trial, so I don't know what happened to him in the end. But at least he did seem to get by with this technicality. It seemed like a pretty clear-cut case. Okay, so that's that one. A murder's exciting, I suppose, but now I got one that's kind of important. How about that? It's a civil case, and it was about 100 years later in this building. It was called the case of Annucci versus Board of Supervisors in 1967. So we're jumping ahead 100 years. The issue relates to equal representation or weighted voting in county matters, county legislation. So previously, each town, all these 17 towns would have one vote on all the issues that were brought up by the county legislature. Well, Kingsbury, or what is now it's called the town of Kingsbury, but it's Hudson Falls basically, has 11,000 people living there. Salem has 2,700 people living here. Fort Edward has 5,900 people living there. Fort Ann has 6,400 people. Argyle has 3,600 people. Greenwich has 4,800 people. White Creek has 3,400 people. Salem has 2,700 people. Kind of get the idea. What is equal representation? Everyone gets one, every town supervisor gets a vote for each of the towns. So that was how the case came to be. And they went through all the arguments. And so the towns with the larger populations wanted their representatives in the county to have more influence in deciding various issues. A plan was presented that provided a mathematical formula to give towns with larger populations additional votes on issues decided. And then the court agreed that the basic principle was going to work, but they added that an additional statistical measure called the Bansoff index had to be applied to refine it a little bit further. So I don't know what that actually did in reality. But anyway, issues in Washington County right now are decided using a weighted voting with Kingsbury and Fort Edward. No, it's not Fort Edward. Actually, Kingsbury and Fort Ann, I guess, having the most votes.
Granville, I think,
Granville, is it even more?
and Greenwich.
Okay. I got Granville is 64. Oh yeah, Granville 64-56 and Fort Ann 64-17. At least that's 2000. But anyway, that's the way it works. And Salem then gets far fewer than let's say Kingsbury. But that was a pretty big case. Bruce, was there any particular issue that you felt we really suffered from as a result of not being able to, or because of the weighted voting?
You know, I wasn't available to pay much attention to that.
Well, not when it was settled, but once you became a supervisor.
Oh, it's just complicated.
Oh, I see.
And supervisors who put together a team isn't the right word, but
Committee?
the famous case for Bill Nickus, who's still an attorney in Fort Edward, was elected to the board, and he got the three other of the largest towns to go with him and from Kingsbury.
Yep.
Probably Fort Edward, Granville, and he got elected chairman.
Oh, I see.
But that wasn't.
And he wasn't a very good chairman?
Well, he's the one we all blame for bringing in the incinerator.
Oh, I see.
And when he got that going, he was no longer up.
I see. Well, okay, so that was a civil case anyway, which has a big effect on Salem in terms of maybe if there were going to be some kind of a jail set here in on Rexley Road or someplace like that, we'd have to get the extra votes from the weighted towns, and that didn't happen. So we don't even have a jail anymore. Not only do we not have court cases in this building, but we don't have a jail either. So anyway, that was weighted voting. All right, I have another specific trial. There was a young lady by the name of Susan Zanta. In 1974, who was visiting at Casino Lake, and turned up missing and was reported. And in the course of the investigation, they set up a command post. The police had a command post there near the lake. They started dredging the lake, or going through it. Kenneth Yarder was a young man at the time. He'd been a waiter at one of the resorts there. They started questioning him. They apparently had some pretty strong inkling that he might know something about it. They asked him to take a polygraph test, and he did that afternoon. And it indicated that he may have more information. They kept him in interrogation all afternoon and evening and into the early morning, when he finally made oral admission and then wrote down that he had done something bad. He was arraigned by the Greenwich Village Justice and transferred to the Salem jail. A grand jury in September, so this was in July. So in September, the grand jury indicted Yarder for murder, for rape in the first and third degree, and criminal possession of controlled substance. When the trial started, in defense, Yarder's lawyers moved for an order to suppress the written and oral statements made by Yarder to the state police. The defendant complained that he was continuously interrogated during that day, not allowed to sleep, not adequately fed, denied counsel, and had been beaten and kicked. There are a lot of specific details. I don't know how gruesome you want to make it, but anyway, he had a bloody nose and other things that had been reported, and a lot of bruises. But it wasn't clear whether he'd actually been beaten or if he had done some self-immolation to cause there to be bruises. But in any case, on trial, he was found guilty. But he went to appeal again, and the court agreed that his trial had not, that in his trial it had not been determined whether or not he'd been beaten in order to get the confession. And so his sentence was dropped. And it was quite a upsetting thing for the community because it seemed so clear. Well, anyway, he left the area and he had trouble elsewhere. And apparently did something similar in another murder case down in Florida. He was out in Nevada, I believe, where he had committed some kind of crime, so he was in prison, and there was something that came up that made it seem as if we might be able, here in Washington County, we might be able to get him on another kind of charge. So he was brought back, and they worked through the process, but it turned out that that wouldn't work either because it was like a double jeopardy type of thing. So he, I think, had to go back to Nevada and spend the rest of his sentence time out there. But it was a pretty dramatic trial here in 1974 in this building.
On the TV every day.
Oh yeah, it was in the news. It was a big deal. I mean, we were in Schenectady area, and we were getting information about it. Of course,
That's where she was
she
from.
had come from there. Yeah.
Was the body ever found?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. I mean, he told where he
No,
left
I
the body.
think it was a farmer found that body.
Oh, it was?
Just stumbled on it and found it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It was in a cornfield someplace.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, my cousin was near his property. I don't know if it was on his property, but. Now, I talked to Judge Mercure, I don't know how to say it.
Tom.
Tom Mercure, today, And he was telling me about his time here as a DA. He went on to be judge and other things, but not in this building apparently as a judge. But as a DA, he did some trials here, and one had to do with murder. And he thinks it was probably the last murder case in this building. So I asked him about it, and he told me, well, it started in November of '78, and he got done in January. The defendant was Henry Stone, and he'd murdered his victim, but admitted it. He didn't cover it up. His victim had been having an affair with his wife, and he found out. So the defense counsel was able to convince the jury that the victim's past behavior, which was, apparently in the community, he's pretty well known for different things, and the fact that he was involved with Stone's wife provided a sympathetic case for the defendant. So the defense claimed that the murder act was in self-defense. And
That's a
the
good,
jury said, I believe it. And so he was acquitted.
that's great. That's a good story.
Yeah. So he was acquitted of murder.
Right.
And then another one that Tom McCure was involved with was an assault case, and it was kind of a little interesting twist to it. It was an inmate from Great Meadows Prison who had been in a fight with one of the guards there, correctional officers. And so the trial was upstairs here, and during the trial the accused became loud and unruly, and I don't know, he just kind of lost control. So he was removed from the courtroom and put in one of the jail cells here, and Tom McCure, he said, we took what do they call it, closed, I got it here. What do they call it when they have TV that you just have?
Closed circuit?
Closed circuit, yeah, closed circuit TV. And so they showed him what was going on. He finally calmed down enough that he could come back into the courtroom, so he did. But for a while he was gone while the trial was going on. But the whole thing was the jury found him guilty, because it was apparently pretty clear, and especially his behavior didn't help him a bit. So a sentence was added to what he already was serving, and he had to go back to Great Meadows. But he'd spent a little time in our jail here, just kind of a break from the rough stuff. So that was Julio Havara. I talked to Tom McCure, as I mentioned, but I also talked to Kelly McKeegan, and they both provided some stories about their time here. And again, this is at the end of when trials were going on and so on. But they had some experience in Salem, so they were telling about it. And talked to Kelly McKeegan. I was in his office, or whatever you call the room that he's in up in Fort Edward, which is very nicely appointed. I mean, it's modern and nice furniture and nicely lighted. But anyway, he was saying there wasn't really room here for any kind of private conversations. If you had a client, you needed to talk about things, where were you going to meet? And so they had place down in the basement here. Well, he's a pretty tall guy, so he said he had to duck to get into the big room. And he said there was a flimsy old little door that they had that closed it off, but it was like a screened door. And there were people walking outside of the room. So when he was trying to have a conversation, it was like, you got to talk quietly because we have privacy here. So anyway, he mentioned that. Then there was like a camera on them, and so when he was finished, he had to unlock the room. He had to have somebody come unlock it. So he waved to the camera, and nobody came. So he went. And finally, somebody came. But that was kind of the thing that he had to deal with. Well, he's talking about in family court, there were sometimes support issues that people had to come in and explain why they hadn't been paying their support. So he said when that was the case, and he was working with him on that, and he was an attorney at that point, not a judge, but he said, I really got to have you, take care of this, because otherwise And so he set up right between this hallway and the jail. There's, you know, a door between the jail and the little hallway, but he'd sit in there. And they could hear the commotion of the prisoners. And so, you know, sometimes it get a little wild in there. But he said, you know, you really ought to take care of this support thing. Otherwise, you know, we never know, but it could be you'll have to spend some time in there. So they'd come up with it, he said, usually. He mentioned also that there was County Judge Orton in the 80s didn't have an office in this building. He was in what's now the clinic downtown, which was where they had the family court proceedings, but that's where Judge Orton had his office too. There was just an obvious need for major upgrade to meet the needs of the times, with things changing all around us. Surrogate court cases were held right in this room. All the records were kept here in the file, in the cabinets there, and in this safe vault. Pretty impressive, huh? Still here. Al uses it now for saving you know, major things from the town and village of historical value. But anyway, surrogate records were there. And I think there were some vaults down in the basement too. Through that door you get down to the basement, and there are some vaults down there. Anyway, that was surrogate court. They also had a room across the hall that surrogate people used. And there was a small law library over there and barrister bookcases. And so all of that, of course, was moved out of here in 1993 when they moved everything to Fort Edward. I mentioned family court was in the clinic area, or clinic downtown, and so different cases were held there. But there were so many people that lived on the other side of the other western part of the county that what they decided to do was to have like half of the cases for family court here in Salem and the other half in Hudson Falls in Sandy Hill courthouse. But when they were held here, they were in the clinic area, which was not a clinic at the time. But all right, and then they basically shut down the courtroom in the 1980s. They didn't have any more trials up in the courtroom. And it wasn't clear why, but part of it was hard to heat the place in the wintertime, especially, as we know. But there were other things there as well that they just moved everything over to Hudson Falls in the courtroom there. But interestingly, the jail was still active, and so any kind of prisoners that had to have trial activity would be transported over to Hudson Falls during that time. And then the jail, of course, was kept here in this location until 2002. But the conditions of the jail became more and more serious. Various deficiencies. Concrete deteriorated in different places. The jail was built in 1906, so it was sometime after the courthouse itself, but it still had some deficiencies. There was hard use of that place too. I mean, people that were in there didn't necessarily take good care of things. So the center access, what do you call it, the shaft place where, I don't know what you call that, but anyway, center access was a problem. When the inspectors would come, they say, well, how do you, if you have to work on something out there, from the second floor especially, there was no flooring out through, and somebody explained, well, we just step from pipe to pipe to get out to where we need to go. No. It was hard to heat in the wintertime, especially on the coldest parts of on the worst days of the winter. In the jail, they handed out extra blankets. The guy was telling me that there was, ice on the interior part of the windows, and it was just very difficult to keep the place warm, not to mention keeping this place warm. And then on the jail, the fire escape was an issue. Many of the supervisors didn't think they really needed a fire escape, but turned out they had to have one or they couldn't keep prisoners in there anymore, so they did get it. So those are some of the things that were happening toward the end of the county use of this facility. All right, so what are the final words here? I found this to be an interesting topic, and I hope somebody else could kind of follow up with what I started here. To be honest, I'm not a historian, and what I presented tonight was simply a talk, and you know, I can tell you what sources I used and so on, but I think it'd be interesting if we did have a little bit more information about this kind of thing. It doesn't have to be done right away, but if somebody's interested, I could help you get started and maybe get some direction. One of the things I found difficult was, unless I had a name of a case or a name of a defendant, I couldn't really go to a particular microfilm to find something. So that would be a key thing to work on.
Bob, how far back do those microphones go?
I was starting because I specified I wanted to start 1869 and forward, but I think there was some that were prior to
Alan
that.
has a diary of a lawyer who lived in Salem in 1850, I think it is. I don't know if he's got one on the shelf there, but it's fascinating. Every day this guy writes, you know, kind of what he did, but he lists all the cases that he
Okay.
handled. Doesn't give you any details, but he
No.
just said, you know.
If you get some names, that'd be the key
Well, that
thing.
would be the place to look.
Yeah.
But that's a small chunk of time, but it would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Well, that's really how I found this Charles Shaw case, because I found out who, like, all the judges were, or the judge was at that time. I just was focusing on after 1869, you know, right after this was built. And once I found out that information of those people, then it was easier to find.
I'm encouraged in this, that my wish may come true.
I'll play with
Bob.
it when I'm not working on
Bob.
Plow Fest.
When I first got on the board, I spent some time reading through a lot of the material we had here about the courthouse, the history and everything else. And there was a case they mentioned in there where a guy was being tried for something, I can't even remember what it was, there wasn't that much detail. But his wife apparently came the night before.
Girlfriend,
She wanted
I think.
to be there, girlfriend or
Yeah.
whatever. And she was up in the attic,
Yeah.
and she was up there listening to the goings on in the courtroom, and she took a misstep and her foot came through the ceiling.
Oh,
Disrupted the whole court proceedings.
That's one of the good ones, you know?
Is that why we have that rule?
No, that's from other purposes, other reasons. But I wanted to end with this also. Salem started out as a place in New York State that attracted pioneers to a frontier that required extraordinarily hard work and ingenuity to provide a safe and productive community for the people who were attracted by what they saw when they arrived. Unusually strong and insightful leaders with exceptional energy were part of the story as Salem developed from a wilderness existence to one of order and prosperity. Men from Salem were involved in the fight for independence from Britain, and then helped to establish a constitution to live by. A courthouse in Salem was built in the 1790s where laws were enforced. The current courthouse that we're in tonight replaced the original one, and it's been here for 150 years and is now an anchor to the historic segment of our community. It also provides a reminder of all the positive things that our predecessors did for this community that we enjoy today. Now it's our turn to keep it going. Well, anyway, thank you for coming. Next week is Jack Waite and Matt Scheit, and we'll be talking about the architecture at the courthouse. So, and keep track of all the other things happening in the courthouse through the rest of the year. We really appreciate your support, and we're doing the best we can, but I think we're doing pretty well. Thank you.